Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about soil composition and the properties of soil that you need to know for the AP exam. Soil is composed of three different sized particles. The largest of the three is sand, the medium-sized would be silt, and the absolute smallest is clay. Now it's important to remember clay is super duper tiny compared to sand. It's significantly smaller. When we're trying to determine the actual type of soil that we're working with, it's actually determined based off of how much or what percentage of that soil is made of each of these three particles. Now we can determine that by using what's called a soil triangle. Now, a lot of students get confused using a soil triangle because they follow the wrong line. Now, I'll give you a hint. You'll notice that the numbers around the outside of the soil triangle on the silt and the sand line are tilted. So if you follow the line that lines up with the direction of the tilt of the number, that is the correct line when using the soil triangle. So let's use an example here. If we take a soil sample and we do some soil testing and we determine that it is 30% clay, 45% silt, and 25% sand, we can use a soil triangle. So first we find the 30% clay on the clay side and we follow that line all the way across. Then we find the silt line and we want to find 45% silt, and then follow that line all the way across the triangle. And we should see these two lines intersect, but just to double check that we did find the right percentages, we look at our 25% sand and draw a line following that line on the triangle. And these lines should all intersect at one single point, and that will tell us the type of soil that we're working with. So in this example, we were looking at clay loam as our soil type. Properties of soil are determined by 5 factors, and we'll go through each of these factors one at a time. The first one is parent material. So the original rock that's underneath that topsoil that was slowly broken down through weathering and then mixed with organic material, the actual chemical composition of that parent rock determines what that soil is going to be like. And that makes sense because these nutrients just don't come out of nowhere. They actually come from that parent rock. So if you have a very nutrient poor parent rock, such as quartz, your soil is going to be very nutrient poor. If you have a nutrient rich, such as calcium carbonate, for your parent rock, your soil is going to be very nutrient rich. And if you look at a map of the entire United States, or really any country, you'll notice that the soil type can vary pretty drastically from one location to another, and that's because the parent rock underneath is different. The second factor that determines the properties of the soil is the overall climate in a particular location. Now, if you're in a very cold climate, such as the Arctic or the taiga, you're going to see that there's this permafrost. So the ground is super cold, it's frozen most of the year, and that means there's not a whole lot of decomposition going on. So you have a buildup of organic material at the top of the soil that's not really getting mixed in. And that leads to some nutrient poor soil. If you look at very humid and tropical locations, there's very rapid weathering, but there's also a whole lot of leaching or moving of that nutrients through the soil column. So you're not necessarily going to have a whole bunch of nutrients available in that whole area, depending on that productivity of the overall ecosystem. The third factor would be topography. So the slope of the land is going to play a pretty significant role on how much water is accumulating and how much erosion is taking place, moving that soil from one location to another. The fourth is organisms. So if we're looking at plants, plants can actually remove nutrients by pulling them up through their roots and making them available to the life above the surface of the soil. Plants can also excrete acids through their roots that actually break down some of that parent rock and lead to some chemical weathering. And as their roots move through the soil, they create air pockets and aerate the soil. Animals also contribute. So animals excrete or produce organic waste through their poop. And as they move through the soil, they create these little tunnels, and that helps to add more air into that soil column. Now again, all organisms also participate in nutrient cycling. The fifth and the final factors associated with determining the properties of soil is time, and that time is due to primary succession. So remember, with primary succession, we start with bare rock. Over time, we have some of that chemical and physical weathering take place, which breaks that rock down into smaller pieces, and then we start to get more organic material added onto that broken up rock, and eventually we have soil formation, and then the stages of succession with plant growth. There are three main categories of soil properties. We have physical properties, chemical properties, and biological properties, and we'll go into detail on each of these. The physical properties have to do with the size and shape and arrangement of the particles of sand, silt, and clay. So we have the first one, which is water holding capacity. And if you take a soil sample and fill it in a little tube with kind of a gauze on the bottom, and you measure out a certain amount of water and you pour it over the top of the soil. Water holding capacity is the total amount of water that can be held within that soil sample and not be draining out the bottom. Now, depending on the type of soil, it might be able to hold more or less water. And that's due to these two properties called porosity and permeability. Now, porosity is talking about the amount of pore space, or the space between the individual particles of the soil. Now, soils that are high in sand have large levels of porosity, so a lot of space between each of the large sand particles. Whereas soils that are high in clay, which has very small particles, those tend to have very low porosity. So water is not able to really fit into that space in between the particles of clay. Now, permeability is talking about the ability of water to move through that soil column. So a soil that has high levels of porosity will also have high levels of permeability, because if there's a lot of space between the individual particles, that water can fit through and move down that soil column. Chemical properties of soil include what's called cation exchange capacity. Now, you do not need to understand or remember or memorize the chemical reactions that are taking place here, but what you do need to know is that cation exchange capacity is related to the nutrient holding ability of a soil. Now, cations are positively charged, whereas clay particles are actually slightly negatively charged. So soils that have a lot of clay tend to be relatively nutrient rich. But here's the problem. If you have a clay soil, it also has very low levels of porosity and permeability, so it tends to have water kind of pond or accumulate on top of it. So if you want to have really good soil for growing things, you want to have some clay in there to help hold and release these cations, but you don't want so much that it also causes water to pond up and to really drown and suffocate the plants that you're trying to grow. The third category would be biological characteristics. So biological contributions include these organisms living in the soil, such as small microorganisms and worms and all sorts of other living critters. Now, these help contribute to the soil properties by creating waste and breaking down decomposing and decaying materials. So in summary, you need to be able to describe the similarities and differences between some of these different soil types. Make sure you understand that soil is composed of 3 different particles: sand, silt, and clay. And you also need to make sure you really understand water holding capacity, which is impacted by porosity and permeability, and that you understand that cation exchange capacity is associated with the ability of a soil to hold and release nutrients. I know that was a lot of information and I went kind of fast. Let me know what your questions are here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.